World Series cricket really took the game by the scruff of the neck and said, in the future, the game is going to have to measure up as a televised spectacle if it's going to maximise its potential. I feel very fortunate to have watched cricket in the Shane Warne era, because that's really what it was. You know, he was the most charismatic and dynamic figure in Australian cricket. I interviewed Jeff Boycott very early in my journalistic career, and I'd been a great Boycott admirer but he was such a prig and such a bore that I learned from that experience that it's always best not to meet your heroes.
Hi guys, this is Shakti from Around the Wicket, where we not only speak about the game, but we try to learn more about the humans behind our sport. Now, I'm slightly nervous today because with me on Around the Wicket, I have the award-winning independent journalist who has been in the field of journalism for over 30 years. He's written over 30 books, 20 of which is on the sport of cricket. He provided the 2012 Bradman oration a year after the great Rahul Dravid provided his delivery. He is now residing in Melbourne, born in England, and he is the lifetime member of the South Yarra Cricket Club. So one thing is for certain, that cricket is a constant in Gideon Haigh's life. Gideon, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here, Shakti.
Firstly, tell me, it's a difficult time in Victoria at the moment with the pandemic, obviously. What's the public sentiment like?
I don't know. I haven't seen them. I'm not allowed to see them. Tell you what my sentiment is. I'm getting a bit fatigued. First lockdown was okay. I got a lot of work done, but I must admit that your motivation begins to subside when as the hours and days and weeks pass. I have actually managed to have the odd hit. There's some nets within 5 kilometres of my home, and I've got a mate who also lives nearby. So we put our masks on and trek down there for our government mandated hour. And I'm hitting the ball pretty well at the moment, but it's a bit, I don't know whether I'm actually in form because I'm not sort of facing open competition, as it were. You find a way to adjust. We actually had our club annual meeting last week on Zoom. I never thought I'd see the day, but we managed to do it, and we managed to get a few things done. And I think, by the time, all being well, by the time the season rolls around, people will be absolutely desperate for cricket. It may be one of the ways in which we kind of rediscover our physically by getting out there and competing as a team, because there's certainly been no community sport for the duration of the lockdown.
And talking about hits, obviously, as I stated, you're a lifetime member of the South Yarra Cricket Club. You've been with them for a long, long time. You're in your 50s from what I hear, so still having a hit. Yeah. What makes the club so special for you?
Look, every club is special to its members. I think after a while, it becomes special because you've been there for so long. I've been there for half my life, 27 years, and I'm not a great joiner of things. I'm an independent journalist. I've been a freelancer for most of my working life, but there is something about that community, that spontaneous community, where everyone knows your name and you know everyone's story, and you're coming together for the reason of something that you love. You might have nothing else in common, but you have cricket, and that's quite a lot. So it's round about this time of year, I'm usually getting a bit excited about the prospects of the coming season, and this year more than ever.
For as long as you've been playing for the South Yarra Cricket Club, you've also been writing for longer than that. And 20 years or over 20 years in the sport of cricket itself. When did you decide that you want to take up a pen and start writing about cricket, and how has it evolved over time?
Yeah, I became a journalist out of school in 1984, and I became a business journalist, actually. That was my first iteration. I started writing about cricket when I was working in London in 1989, 90, and I was covering business over there, and I thought, I actually was quite fancied having a go at writing about cricket. So, so I thought I'd begin to file some pieces to The Age, who I was working for at the time. I covered the England-India series, funnily enough. Sachin Tendulkar got his first 100 during that series, which I saw at Old Trafford. And Graham Gooch got his 333 and 123 at Lords, and you felt as though you were part of something special. It was very enjoyable. I thought, well, I could have a go at this. I mean, I've kept up writing about other things. I don't really consider myself a cricket journalist so much as a journalist. One of the things that he writes about being cricket, but I certainly have had a very enjoyable and pleasant life writing about the game that I love, and periodically I go back and play to kind of recalibrate my enjoyment, because I do think fundamentally it's a player's game. It's a game that's designed to be played first and foremost. You can enjoy it in other ways, but there's nothing like the intimacy of sort of individual and collective combat that cricket gives you.
You talked about writing. Does it ever get to a point where it can become lonely? Because they say that the best friend for a writer could be the scroll and his or her thoughts. Does it ever get to a point where it can get tedious for yourself?
Tedious? Yeah, it does. During the course of a summer, there's the constant stress of coming up with something new to say. You don't want to repeat yourself, and given how long I've been writing, it's pretty easy to repeat yourself. Ian Chappell keeps reminding us that it's a simple game, and sometimes writers are inclined to overcomplicate it just for the sake of something new to say. But there's also, you've also made a sort of a considerable intellectual and emotional investment in the game, and you are extracting a return in the process of writing. And there are those days where you just wouldn't be anywhere else in the world. Say the last day at Headingley last year, when Ben Stokes made his match-winning 100. I mean, that was just a phenomenal feeling in the press box. You felt like fan, devotee, player, lover, writer, all in one, and part of a great moment in sporting history. So those days are few and far between, and you appreciate them all the more because they are rare, but they do come along. And the great thing about cricket is that it's a day of Test cricket is such a big palette to work on. You've just got so many colours. You've just got so many brushes. You've got so many different genres that you can tap into. So many different approaches to take. So many different characters are paraded in front of you. There's so much history that you see if you're intelligent enough to know the game's background. It all kind of links together, and it's a very rich writing opportunity.
You've stated before that when you first started writing, it was difficult for getting cricketers to oblige in interviews or provide you with information, obviously because you were new to the game as well. How was that initial feeling like, or sentiment like? And
well, it was probably easier 30 years ago to get access to a cricketer than it is now. It's funny enough, I pulled a piece out the other day. I was going through my file and I found a piece that I'd written back in 1990, a piece about Terry Alderman. Terry Alderman bowled a beautiful ball in the Brisbane Test that had bowled Mike Atherton. I thought, that's an interesting piece. I should ring Terry Alderman. I remember I just rang the hotel, got put through to his room, and he was in the bath. And he gave me an interview on the phone about how he'd bowled this particular outswinger. And I thought, oh, that's the way you do it. Nowadays, of course, the interaction of player and journalist is so sterilised and so formalised that it's almost like there was an old Soviet joke about we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. In cricket journalism, it's a little bit like they pretend to talk and we pretend to listen. the press conference has become such a regimented and tedious affair that it's a surprise to me when anything unusual or unique or insightful emerges from it. And it's almost as though no one really expects it anymore. What people sort of provide the first half of the sentence for the player and expect the player to finish it off. And they've usually got half the story written. It just gaps in it for quotes by the time they get back to the press box and finish it off. It really can get that kind of cricket journalism, which is really could almost be performed by artificial intelligence, really is a bit soul destroying.
It's become almost like a game of cliches. You expect a similar answer every time you walk in to a press box or
yes,
listen.
You do.
Yeah, listen.
Yeah.
Your first book, the Cricket War, the inside story of Kerry Packer's World Series cricket. When did you decide, or how did you decide that you want to take on this project? And for all our young listeners or any young cricketers that are coming that are unaware about the impact of World Series cricket, for you, what legacy has World Series cricket left, apart from obviously the coloured clothing that we saw introduced?
Well, it was the discovery that cricket had a market value, had a value as a commercial property that could be monetised by broadcasters and by sponsors to the game's beneficiation and the players' enrichment at the same time.
Yeah.
Previously, cricket had been covered from a deferential distance by television. World Series cricket really took the game by the scruff of the neck and said, in the future, the game is going to have to measure up as a televised spectacle if it's going to maximise its potential. And Kerry Packer was perhaps the first man to realise that, to really throw the resources at a game of cricket in such a way as to turn it into something that was a major league sort of broadcast fodder and potentially a huge market advantage for a broadcasting corporation. In terms of my own life, I was in grade 6 when World Series cricket hove into view. I was getting interested and passionate about the game for the first time. So this will be strange for younger viewers and listeners, but in those days, cricket was on one channel. One channel, the ABC in Australia, and all of a sudden it was on 2. So you had sort of a 100% increase in the size of televised cricket, and that was extraordinary. And of course, it was being presented in such an unusual and colourful and exotic way that it was kind of engaging and beguiling. Even though I must have confessed that at the time, being a conservative, rather prudish young man, I thought that all this talk about money and spectacle was a little bit unseemly. I read the book in 1992 because I realised the 15th anniversary of World Series cricket was coming up. It was an opportunity in a way to revisit my own childhood, to check the historical record against my own recollections. But I also realised that it had been a major change in the game that we had almost come to take for granted. We'd come to believe that World Series cricket was inevitable. In fact, everything is inevitable in hindsight, but in fact, it was extremely inevitable at the time. And it took people to make bold decisions and for players to examine their allegiances and to look at the lot of the professional sportsmen in a new light. Yeah. And I thought it would be worth going to speak to some of the participants in order to get their recollections, that they had sufficient time to evaluate the decisions that they'd made, to see how it had affected their own life, and to see what they thought of them and what they remembered. And to my surprise, a lot of them had never been asked. So I was the first person who'd really sort of dug into their memories, and the stories were tremendously fresh and engaging. And it was a great experience of learning how to talk to cricketers for the first time, to understand what you have in common with them, and also what's different about players who've reached the very, very top of any pursuit.
What makes a cricketer a good subject for you?
Well, for one thing, I play. Immediately that we've got something in common, and it doesn't matter that the game, that the level at which I play is far, far lower. It's still 11 men against 11.
Yeah,
It still
exactly.
takes place on a grassy field across 22 yards. It's still the same kind of excruciating weight to go into bat. It's still the same kind of head-to-head physical challenge, the clash between egos that takes place on the field, whether you're at the top of the game or the bottom.
Yeah.
So, after a while, you've interviewed enough cricketers that you begin to see the common characteristics that they have under the skin. It's also a game where there is a lot of time to think. There is a lot of time to consider. There's a lot of time to grieve. There's a lot of time to fret and to feel anxious. And if you're any sort of person at all and you have any sort of powers of reflection, well, actually, I think that cricket breeds powers of reflection, breeds a certain kind of philosophical personality. This idea that kind of you're only as good as your last performance, and that the game can make a fool of you at the very next moment. So when it comes to me talking to a cricketer for whatever reason, I know that we have this set of experiences or this set of attitudes in common, and that takes us a good long way.
One of your subjects is possibly the most or greatest entertainer that the game has ever seen, or arguably the greatest leg spinner in world cricket ever. Shane Warne, your book on Warne, provided a reflection of Shane Warne as a person and as a cricketer. To you, though, personally, what made Shane Warne so fascinating?
Well, like I said, I grew up in Australia in the 1970s and 80s, and in that period, you often got told about leg spin. You often heard old salts tell you how fantastic leg spin was and what an amazing skill and how transfixing and original it was, but you never saw it. The leg spinners of the Australian team in the 1980s, your Peter Sleeps and your Bob Hollands and your Trevor Hones, they were honest toilers, but there was nothing magical about them. The magic was all in pace bowling. That was who you wanted to be, who you looked up to. But all of a sudden, when Shane Warne appears in 1992, it's almost as though he's a kind of a myth made flesh. He's the player that had been prophesied, and lo and behold, leg spin was every bit as marvellous, even more marvellous than you could possibly have imagined. I feel very fortunate to have watched cricket in the Shane Warne era, because that's really what it was. He was the most charismatic and dynamic figure in Australian cricket, despite the fact that there was a constellation of talents in that Australian side. He was the guy who you always looked to. He was the guy who always provided you with the story of the day in some ways. What Warne was doing, it didn't matter whether he'd taken 5 for, whether he'd taken 1 for 100. There was something incredibly dramatic and exciting about his presence on the field and his appearance at the crease that made you sit up and pay attention. So tremendous gift for a watcher and a writer. And the opportunity to write about him wasn't actually my idea. It was my publisher, Ben Ball at Penguin, said, "Why don't you write a book about Warne?" And I thought, you know what? I've never even thought of that, but it's actually quite a good idea. And I wrote it quite quickly, and I wrote it for fun, and I wrote it to enjoy myself.
Yeah.
Because I thought, well, if you can't enjoy yourself when you're writing about Warne, then you really reconsider your vocation. He's all about enjoyment. He's all about fun. Sometimes he's about indiscreet fun and silly fun, but it's always fun. And it's also trivial at the same time. Warne often sort of claimed, or Warne often sort of maintained that, his private life was his own business, even though he made it our business by leading his life so publicly. It doesn't really matter. It only affects me, and it only affects my kin. And, he was right. He was right all along. And he dragged us around to our way of thinking just by being Warne, just by living his authentic life.
Yeah.
And, I've got to hand it to him. He's still a kind of fascinating figure.
Yeah. From an Australian cricketer to the Australian cricket team, I think one of your recent works, Crossing the Line, how Australian cricket lost its way in the aftermath of obviously the Capetown saga, the ball tampering issue. You provide almost an in-depth forensic analysis of the degrading culture of the Australian cricket team, and it was more than just what happened on the field, but it started up obviously from the top in your books. Do you feel that Australian cricket had this coming for a long, long time? And again, when or how did you decide that I want to write about this issue?
Yeah, I think Australian cricket missed some warning signs along the way. I think in some ways their own market research was telling them that the public had rather soured on the Australian team. They didn't relate to them in quite the same way. They certainly didn't identify with them, and it wasn't necessarily that, well, they were a subject of some ambivalence among fans. And I think Cricket Australia succumbed to the idea that victory would wash away all sins, that it didn't really matter to the public how they won, providing that they did. So what was remarkable about Sandpapergate was how quickly and seemingly unanimously the public made up its mind, almost before we had the opportunity to suggest how they might want to think about it. Because if you recall, the incident happened early in the morning, too late for the newspapers in Australia. It was a social media-led public response, not a media-led one. We, in some ways, we picked up the public mood. I can remember being a friend of mine texting me at sort of like 5 in the morning and saying that, I remember the text. It was from a friend of mine who doesn't know anything about cricket. She just said, "Smith will have to go." And I went, oh. I'd seen the incident on the field. I had not at that point seen Steve Smith's press conference. And I thought, ball tampering, there are disciplinary systems, there are codes of conduct that might have been transgressed. Surely Smith won't have to go, but I was wrong, and she was right, because it wasn't a cricket story. It was a conduct story. It was an ethical story, and it was a story about the culture. And in some ways, the cricket media was as much in a bubble as the players. I don't think we intuited the significance of it straight away. I think what was telltale about it was the press conference, where Smith seemed to express kind of no contrition, not even a particular understanding of his transgression. He went in there, I think, not quite knowing what he was going to say. And, the first question that he was asked was, "So, Skipper, tell us what happened out there." And he didn't know. He threw to Bancroft and he said, "Well, you talk through them." And every single answer that he gave deepened his plight. And I think by the time he left that press conference, he was probably doomed. It was also a bit of an echo chamber. Everyone kind of reinforced everyone else's indignation, and these things do happen. And then the Prime Minister gets involved, and when the Prime Minister gets involved on a slow news day, that has the way of intensifying the public's response. And people started to go, "Well, yeah, what he said. I'm really disappointed." And I'm disappointed not just about this incident, but I'm disappointed about the attitude that it bespeaks, and perhaps an accumulation of sins over the preceding few years.
The win at all costs attitude, that was probably their downfall. One of the lines that I found very powerful was, if I can quote, it said, "I cannot deny," this is yourself as a follower of the game for so long, "I cannot deny that the big cricket I am engaged in watching and writing about feels less precious, less special, less representative, and less part of the civic life than it used to. More the property of commercial and bureaucratic elite puffed up with its own importance." Do you feel that this sense of commercialism and self-absorbed nature is there in the wider cricket community, globally? And what can be done to get that that traditional spirit back into the game?
It does feel like the cricket is very detached from our day-to-day experiences. The players are very cut off. The players are quite aloof. And I think that's because of the organisational settings. I think it's also because of the sheer amount of cricket being played. A lot of it is played just simply because an infrastructure exists in order to facilitate it. It doesn't have any particular meaning. It's really about satisfying commercial and contractual obligations that the administrative body has agreed to. When the players line up for the national anthem, you know that their breast is not swelling with patriotic pride. You know, fundamentally they are professionals doing a professional job to the highest possible standards, but they aren't drawing inspiration from. They aren't necessarily an expression of the nation's ambitions in the way that perhaps the Australian team was originally. Don't forget that, of course, the Australian team prefigures federation in Australian history. It's a way in which we come to nationhood. This idea that the colonies can sink their differences and come together on the cricket field is an expression of the idea of unification in this country. I think, and I wouldn't want to diss the players. I mean, I think they do genuinely love the game. And they go into it because they love it, and they love it also partly because they're very good at it. But at the same time, you know, they've got to look after themselves, because the shelf life of a professional sportsman is short and perilous and cannot be guaranteed. And that, you know, it's an individual game in a team environment in all the ways that we can define that.
Do you really believe that they don't, go out there puffing their chest out with the the national anthem with pride?
I think they've kind of habituated it. They did, I think, make a genuine attempt over the last couple of years to re-establish contact with the Australian people. It was interesting, given the reminder that they'd experienced about how they couldn't necessarily take public allegiance for granted. They actually decided to offer a little bit more of themselves.
Yep.
In some ways, their documentary series, The Test, which you probably watched on Amazon Prime, is them kind of trying to demystify themselves in the public eye, to show that they're flesh and blood like everybody else. They're just people out there trying to do their best. They wouldn't have done that, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. They wouldn't have felt anywhere near that degree of kind of accountability or need to explain themselves. So that's a positive development. But the senses of privilege and entitlement return pretty easily unless they're regularly challenged. So in some respects, Sandpapergate was therapeutic, was cathartic for the game. But you can never have those kind of reminders often enough, as far as I'm concerned.
You've watched a lot of cricket. You've written a lot about cricket. What do you feel that the modern game has in terms of not just the developments that it's made, but what's the biggest asset of the modern game compared to the yesteryears that you've watched?
Well, its biggest advantage is also its biggest disadvantage, which is the sheer varieties of the game. It's now almost impossible to say what cricket is. It has so many different variations, which in some ways makes it extremely adaptable and makes it extremely porous. In others, kind of leaves it sort of competing against itself. And the good book says that has devoted itself cannot stand. And sooner or later, those varieties of the game will have to be rationalised. I don't think there's enough. I don't think the market's quite big enough, and I don't think the playing resources are quite big enough to sustain the huge variety of cricket. I think you can already see the erosion of first class cricket, the significance of first class cricket, 4-day cricket. You can sense that the number of test playing nations is probably going to decline. It's going to dwindle over the next 10 years. Because the game is just so difficult. It's so difficult to bank in some of the peripheral nations of the world, because they don't necessarily have the economies to support a game as kind of large and leisurely as a test match. But we're almost kind of introducing new formats more quickly than we can take care of the old. I And I'll be interested to see what strides T10 cricket makes over the next 3 or 4 years. Potentially, it could make T20 cricket look rather languid by comparison. I haven't actually seen a game of T10 cricket, but I'm sure it's completely crazy, like a highlights package.
Do you feel that not much is done with Test cricket, the traditional form? Because some of the best, from my personal point of view, some of the best spectacles that I've experienced has been in the longer format. Do you feel that more needs to be done?
How good have these Test matches been?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just terrific. And there's a lesson in that, isn't there? I think low-scoring Test matches where teams struggle to make 300, 350. They are intensely watchable. I mean, even that hour last night of England versus Pakistan. Oh, just terrific. There's just no game like it. Every ball was a potential wicket. Every ball survived was a potential advantage to the batting side. It was fantastic to watch. No other format gives you that kind of balance, gives you that kind of tension, it gives you both the loudness and the quiet. Test cricket, those moments of incredible stillness and incredible drama concentrated in a single ball, and those moments of carnival, of spectacle, of escapade, like Stokes at Headingley last year. Test cricket still pushes all the buttons with me because it's just got so much variety and so much skill and so much scope for every player, every physique, every temperament. It still touches the part that the other parts don't miss. Maybe Test cricket's become a little bit too serious. Maybe it's become too significant to lose a Test match. Sometimes you watch Test cricket from South Asia being played on very, very flat pitches with huge scores being made. And you just think, well, who could possibly really enjoy this except for a statistician? And even in Australia at times, you think, those Test matches where Australia makes 550, 600 in the first innings, and Steve Smith and David Warner get huge scores. You just think, that's so one-sided. That's so parochial, frankly. That's cricket designed for Australia to succeed rather than the game to prosper. I think we should think about potential equalising mechanisms. Perhaps the use of the Duke ball in other countries. I'd like to see the Duke used in Test matches out here.
I think that's what makes Test cricket in England so watchable, is because it's got everything for everyone: conditions, ball, pitches. So
the ball is slightly on top, and every run has to be there. Yeah.
Exactly. So Gideon, I have 8 to 10 rapid-fire questions, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Of the 20 books that you have written on cricket, which one is your favourite?
It would have to be the least successful. So perhaps the Big Ship, the book that I wrote about Warwick Armstrong, because I know that was terribly unsuccessful, but it was enormously fun to do, and a period of the game that I felt as though I knew reasonably well, those first 2 decades of the 20th century, but I actually had a lot to learn, and the opportunity to write about Armstrong was actually a chance to write about the game. A lot of the things about the game that I take for granted, and a lot of the things that were kind of set in train in that period that became part of phenomenon that even now we're coming to terms with. Professionalisation, commercialisation, big personalities, the England versus Australia rivalry. It was a great learning experience. So ask me tomorrow and I'll give you a different answer.
I'll ask you again tomorrow. Let's see. Your second question is your favorite cricketer that you have interviewed or written about till date.
Well, I'll tell you one who didn't really impress me very early on in my career.
All right, we'll change that question around.
I interviewed Jeff Boycott very early in my journalistic career. No. And I'd been a great Boycott admirer because my father's from Yorkshire and I'd always kind of identified with that gritty sort of northern stoic. But he was such a prig and such a bore that that I learned from that experience that it's always best not to meet your heroes. Who have I really enjoyed meeting? Well, in some ways, my favourite cricketer, or the player who's perhaps opened my eyes most to the cricket experience is Ed Cowan.
Yep.
Who I'm a friend of. I knew him before he played Test cricket. I knew him, I was a friend of his throughout his Test career. We're still friends now. And he has given me insights into the game through our friendship that have stayed with me, that have been genuinely kind of mind-broadening. I mean, Ed is a great guy, very smart guy, lovely, warm, generous, caring, but he's tough. But he's very tough, and he's got immense self-belief. He hides it well, but he getting to know Ed was for me a process of realization that those players who get to the top, they are different. They are different to you and I. They've got a level of trust in their own talent that someone like me doesn't feel. He always backed himself to succeed, Ed. I mean, look, he's ended up having a great record at Test level, but to get there, to be tough enough to get to the top and to stay there, and to watch him do it was a bit of a revelation for me.
It's probably the same with you and journalism. I mean, Ed might think the same about you with that respect. What's the biggest challenge in journalism currently for you?
The barriers to entry in journalism are low. They're lower than they've ever been. It's easy to get into print because blog or even Twitter, and you can turn yourself into a voice. The toughest thing is making a career out of it. The barriers to entry are low, but the capacity to monetize is very, very limited. And it's I don't think that's going to get any easier or any better. The traditional homes of mainstream journalism, their business model is kind of fundamentally broken. And even for me, who's been in the game for 36, 37 years, we're just clinging to the wreckage.
Number 4 is, what is your most prized possession? That doesn't have to include cricket.
Not really a great possession person. I've always been perfectly kind of happy in my own company, and pleasure to me is just one book away. The most useful thing in my life, though, probably is my cricket bat, which is in the kitchen at the moment, which is something that I reach for regularly, just simply for the physical pleasure of swinging it. I've played some of my best innings in the kitchen.
Hopefully you haven't broken anything. When of all the writers or books that you have read upon, who is your favorite in terms of writer or an author?
In cricket?
Anything. Doesn't have to be
generally. I've got a bit of a thing for Jeff Dyer. Jeff Dyer, the English kind of essayist and novelist and travel writer, whose a number of his books are kind of touchstones for me. He writes in a thoroughly engaging and kind of fascinating and amusing and delightful way. And I also had the experience of interviewing him a couple of years ago at the Melbourne Writers' Festival. And to my pleasure, in contrast to the experience of interviewing Jeff Boycott, Jeff Dyer is a lot more engaging personally than Jeff Boycott. He was everything that I'd hoped him to be. He talks like he writes in a very approachable and accessible and warm kind of way.
One rule that needs to change in cricket.
Good question. Well, I think one protocol should change, or one kind of taboo which is the taboo on Mancatting. I've never quite understood the kind of the moral indignation about Mancatting. I don't have a problem with it, and I never really have. If a batsman wants to crib
take an advantage,
yeah, I don't have a problem with running them out of the bowler's end. I've never done it because I've never been that kind of organised or that athletic or that far-sighted. But it's interesting if you read. There was Mancatting before Mancat. You read sort of things happening in the 19th century and early 20th century, and it was regarded as actually pretty clever to do it. Funnily enough, the first person to attempt one in first-class cricket in Australia was Warwick Armstrong, who I wrote a book about.
Exactly.
And people were agreed at the time, pretty clever, pretty shrewd, tough, but fair. Perhaps the fact that it was kind of identified with an Indian player in Australia led to it being kind of denounced as sharp practice. But at the same time, Bradman in his autobiography says that he just felt that Bill Brown was inattentive and Mancat was right to take advantage of him. I kind of think that the attitude to Mancatting is a little bit of a proxy for other beliefs about transgressions of sportsmanship. People have a desire to kind of draw a line somewhere, and the Mancat has a kind of a symbolic quotient. But I think that I also think that's kind of counterproductive. And I think in T20 cricket, where you're often dealing in transacting in millimetres, I'm surprised if you started to see it more often, and perhaps the taboo will begin to erode. And I think that would be a good thing.
Your favourite memory in cricket till date? Something that has been the most memorable for you, apart from the interview with Jeffrey Boycott?
It might be winning my first premiership as a club cricketer, which I won back in 2015. I played my whole career from the age of 9 without winning a premiership. And I think I played in 7 losing grand finals, and I got to the point where I thought, I might actually get through my whole life without winning a flag. And I thought, okay, I can cope with that. Not very good, so stands to reason I'm not going to be on too many winning sides. I might as well get used to the idea. I've had plenty of pleasure and plenty of companionship out of the game over the years, and it's been enormously enriching. And then I won my first flag, and of course I realised I'd been completely wrong. There is nothing that beats winning a flag. There's nothing so fun and exciting and uplifting, and I just can't wait to do it again. And in fact, that's really why I'm playing on, because I want to experience that feeling once again. I mean, it's strange. This is one of the areas where kind of playing can kind of inform your kind of writing experience or your writing perspective. I'd always been a little bit critical of players who I felt had overstayed their welcome, who went on that one tour too many for the sake of, getting that one last win. I'd always thought, oh, come on, be sensible. You've got to realise when your time is up. And I actually realised after I played in that flag, I thought, that's why players play on, because there's just nothing to beat this. The experience that I had with those other 10 blokes on that field that day, whenever we meet again in future, we will smile because of the experience we had in that game. And I've been on the losing side enough to know that it feels pretty bad.
What was it? Seven flag finals? Was it 7 flag finals?
Seven losing grand finals. Yeah,
wow. Yeah. Nothing beats. Nothing beats team success. Definitely
nothing beats team success. Exactly. I mean, I didn't contribute very much. I made a run out in that game, which I was pretty happy with, but I didn't make any runs, and I don't think I bowled. But I played an important part in the winning of the semi-final to get us into the final. So I kind of had a little sort of playing share and made a big noise, and it was just a great experience. That evening. Funny, next day had a family day and I didn't really think about the game again. And on Monday morning, I went for a walk. I was walking to the MCG, and I started to think about the game again. And I teared up because of the kind of the accumulated emotion of that game. I just thought that was special. I was part of something special. A sea flag in the Mercantile Cricket Association, and it was just a great kind of personal moment.
Big congratulations to you and your team.
Thanks.
To have persistence for that long, and then at least to have that feeling of success. Like you said, nothing beats that. Where's your most favorite place to watch cricket from?
Oh, from the balcony of my home ground, Como Park in South Yarra. Yeah, It's a beautiful ground. It's a natural amphitheatre. It's kind of carved out of a hill. We've got some very nice club rooms. Beautiful balcony, great to play a game there, great to sit back and think about the game afterwards on the balcony. And like I said, I've been there for 27 years. I know every nook and cranny of that ground and that building. Had some great experiences there, some terrible experiences too. But it's a place where I just feel automatically at home. I walk over the brow of that hill, walk down to training, and I know I'm, no matter what, no matter how bad my day's been, no matter what kind of predicament I might face professionally or personally, the next couple of hours of training or of playing are going to be great.
Awesome. South Yarra Cricket Club. Everyone go down there and watch a game when Melbourne opens up. I've got two more questions. One is, what is the best thing about the women's game that you have noticed?
Technique, because it has to be about technique, because the players can't kind of muscle their way out of trouble. I find women's players really interesting to watch technically, the way in which they compensate for their lack of physical presence. And it's astonishing to see how players have realised that technique can get you so far. The fact that Alyssa Healy is capable of hitting the ball such distances with being a small person, not necessarily having the bat speed or the bat to hit like Chris Gale, but she can hit a long way. And she's hugely competitive, and she's hugely skillful, and she's incredibly engaging as well. Perhaps that's the other thing that they've got going for them. They're still very approachable personalities. It was interesting, a couple of years ago I went down to a little local library down in the Yarra Valley to talk about cricket one night. There was a little audience there, 20 or 30 people. There were some kids there from a local club. They were playing under 12s. And so I pulled them up on stage and asked them some questions. And one of the questions I asked them, who's your favourite player? One of them said Mitchell Starc. One of them said Michael Clarke. One of them said Shane Warne. And another one said Alyssa Healy. And I thought, right, okay, boys are starting to look up to girls as role models. That's a great step forward for the game. And of course, that T20 final earlier this year was a great, an epoch-making moment in international women's cricket. Just a shame that they haven't had the opportunity to build on it since. And everything's getting pushed back as well. One final question is, do you have any projects or books in the pipeline? Got 2 non-cricket books, which I'm doing. I've finished both the manuscripts. One is a book about the future of the office. It's called The Momentous Uneventful Day, and it's about how we got the offices that we have and what the future of the office might be. And the other one's called The Brilliant Boy, H.V. Evatt and the Great Australian Descent. It's about famous High Court case from 1939 in which a woman sued a local council for negligence after her 7-year-old son, drowned in a council maintenance ditch. And it's an important case in the history of the tort of negligence in Australia. This idea of being compensated for trauma, which is something that we now take for granted, but in 1939 in Australia, it was a very revolutionary idea, and was a fascinating story to research, and just one of those things where I heard about the story at a legal conference 2 or 3 years ago, and I thought, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I should do a book about that in order to find out more. That's one of the great pleasures of being a journalist, is that you can find a story and you can use your vocation as the opportunity to indulge your curiosity. That's why I'm still a journalist after 37 years.
We're looking forward to those books, Gideon. Thank you so much for joining me on Around the Wicket. I appreciate your time, appreciate the knowledge and wisdom that you bring to anything that you do. All the best, stay safe, and hopefully you can start writing more about cricket very, very soon.
That'd be nice. Thanks a lot, Shakti.